Premolar. The mandibular second premolar represents transition between first premolars and molars. This tooth is usually larger than the first premolar and has better development than the first premolar in most of its aspects. It shows the first evidence of calcification between 2 years and 3 months to 2.5 years. The enamel is completed between 6 and 7 years of age. The eruption time is usually after the first premolar at 11 to 12 years, while root is completed 2 to 3 years later between 13 and 14 years. The mandibular second premolar usually shows the following variation from the mandibular first premolar. First, it's usually larger of the two mandibular premolars, which is opposite of the situation found in maxilla, where the first premolar is larger than the second. Usually, the mandibular second premolar, in fact, is smaller or shorter than the first premolar in crown length. However, it possesses greater or larger labiobuccolingual dimension by 0.5 millimeters. Also, crown length is longer by 0.5 millimeter, while the mesiodistal diameter is usually the same between the two teeth. Another characteristic feature is that the lingual cusps are more developed. As you can see here, in most of the cases, there are two lingual cusps. They are more developed at higher level. They are functional, and this will produce more efficient occlusion with the maxillary antagonist. And because of this, the mandibular second premolar will function more like a molar than a canine. Also, it's characterized by having a single root, which is larger and longer by 0.5 millimeters than that of the first premolar. Usually, the mandibular second premolar is the least premolar to be found with two roots or two canals. It's usually, in most of the cases, or almost always found with single root and single canal. Regarding the occlusal aspect, there are two common forms. The first is the 3-cusp type, which is the most common. This is the 3-cusp type. And the second is the 2-cusp type. The 3-cusp type is characterized by having a more angular occlusal outline due to the presence of two lingual cusps, the mesiolingual and the distolingual, while the 2-cusp type appear more rounded from the occlusal aspect. Now moving to the detailed description of the mandibular second premolar. Usually all the aspects will be described in comparison with the mandibular first premolar, except for the occlusal aspect, which will be discussed in more detail. Regarding the buccal aspect, the main differences between the two teeth. The buccal cusp is shorter and less pointed, as you can notice here. It is shorter. The cusp ridges shows less angulation or less slope. The cusp tip is less pointed. The buccal ridge is usually less prominent than the buccal ridge of the mandibular first. Also, the cusp ridges, either we can see that the mesial cusp slope is shorter than the distal, or in many cases they are of equal size, and the cusp tip will usually be located in the center with the long axis of the root. The contact areas, of course, are broader and more occlusally located, as they are at the same level mesially and distally. They are usually located near the junction between the occlusal and the middle thirds of the crown, so they are at higher level compared to the first. The root, as mentioned before, is longer by 0.5 millimeter, and it's broader mesiodistally. Moving to the lingual aspect. The first, or the main characteristic is that there is little lingual convergence of the crown, as you can notice here. Because of this, we can see less of the mesial and distal aspects. This is the mesial and this is the distal. Also, the lingual cusps or lingual lobes are more developed. They are longer. The lingual cusps are longer, therefore less of the occlusal surface can be seen. So this is a main difference between the mandibular second and first, in that less of the mesial, distal, and occlusal surfaces can be seen from the lingual aspect. In the three cusp type, there are three cusps, one buccal cusp and two lingual cusps. The mesiolingual is larger than the distolingual cusp. This is the mesiolingual, and this is the distolingual. They will be separated by the lingual groove, which will extend short distance into the lingual surface. While in the two cusp type, there will be only single lingual cusp opposite to the buccal cusp, and there will be no groove. Of course, we can see also the cusp ridges of the buccal cusp from this aspect and the portion of the buccal triangular ridge. The crown outline, as you can notice, is usually bulbous with a constricted cervical area. The cervical area is constricted while the crown is usually having or showing a bulbous outline. This is a natural tooth specimen of mandibular second premolar. As you can notice here, this is the mesial cusp ridge, this is the distal cusp ridge. The occlusal or the contact areas are usually higher near the junction between the occlusal and middle thirds, while lingually you can notice the larger mesiolingual cusp, and this is the distolingual cusp separated by the lingual groove. We can see the cusp ridges of the buccal cusp and part of the buccal triangular ridge. We can notice that there is much less lingual convergence. As you can notice, mesodistal diameter of the crown on the lingual and the buccal aspect is nearly equal, so there is less lingual convergence of the crown and the root compared to the mandibular first premolar. Now moving to the mesial aspect, the following features can be noticed. First, the crown is wider buccolingually by 0.5 millimeter. So the difference in buccolingual dimension is 0.5 millimeter between the first and second premolars. Usually the buccal cusp is shorter and it's located buccal to the long axis of the tooth. In the mandibular first, it was located with the center of the tooth. Here it will be located buccal to the long axis of the tooth. The tip of the lingual cusp will be also located in line with the lingual border of the root. Of course, this configuration result is the result of the fact that the mandibular second premolar, the crown of the mandibular second, show less lingual tipping compared with the mandibular first, which show much more lingual tipping. Therefore, its cusp will be centered with the long axis of the root. There is much greater development of the lingual cusp or cusps. They are longer, approaching the length of the buccal cusp. Also, the mesial marginal ridge differs from that of the mandibular first in that it's located at a higher level. It is usually at right angle to the long axis of the tooth. And because of this configuration, less of the occlusal surface can be seen compared with the mandibular first. The root is usually longer by 0.5 millimeter, as was mentioned earlier. Regarding the buccal and lingual crest of contours, the buccal crest of contour is located at the junction between the cervical and middle thirds. It will be located here, while the lingual height of contour is usually located between the junction of the occlusal, or at the junction between the occlusal and middle thirds. So this is the position of the buccal height of contour, and this is the lingual height of contour. The distal aspect, the main differences between the mesial and distal is that the distal marginal ridge is at a lower level, therefore more of the occlusal surface can be seen, and we also can see the mesiolingual cusp. In the three cusp type, the mesiolingual can be seen because it's larger than the distolingual, so from the distal aspect in the three cusp type, the three cusps can be seen. The distal contact area, of course, will be broader because it will make contact with the mandibular first molar. If we examine a natural tooth specimen of mandibular second premolar from the mesial and distal aspect, it's obvious that from the mesial aspect, less of the occlusal surface can be seen compared with the distal aspect because the mesial marginal ridge is at a higher level. So from the mesial aspect, we can see the buccal ridge, the buccal cusp and the buccal triangular ridge and the mesiolingual cusp and mesiolingual cusp ridge, and the mesial marginal ridge. From the distal aspect, we can see the buccal cusp and the buccal triangular ridge, the mesiolingual cusp and the distal lingual cusp, and the distal marginal ridge. Moving to the occlusal aspect, as mentioned earlier, the mandibular second premolar has two forms, either free cusp type or two cusp type. They differ significantly in their occlusal aspect rather than the other aspects. So in case of the free cusp type, usually the outline of the crown is square. As you can notice here, the outline is square, lingual to the buccal cusp ridges due to the presence of two lingual cusps. It has three distinct cusps, the buccal cusp, the mesiolingual cusp, and the distal lingual cusp. The buccal cusp is the largest, then the mesiolingual, and the distal lingual is the smallest. Each cusp has a well-formed triangular ridge. So this is the buccal triangular ridge, this is the mesiolingual triangular ridge, and this is the distal lingual triangular ridge. Of course, there are two triangular fossa, the mesial and the distal. So this is the mesial. They are triangular in shape. This is the mesial triangular fossa, and this will be the distal triangular fossa. The free cusp type shows three developmental grooves: the mesial developmental groove, the distal developmental groove, and the lingual developmental groove. They all meet and merge in the central pit. So this will be the central pit. The mesial developmental groove travel in a mesial direction, while the distal developmental groove in a distal direction. The lingual groove will extend between the two lingual cusps and end in the lingual surface. So the merge of these, or the junction of these three grooves, will form the central pit. This is the central pit. The central pit and these grooves will provide what's called a Y-shaped pattern of the occlusal aspect. So the three cusp type characterized by having a Y-shaped pattern of its groove, or the grooves that running across the occlusal surface. The mesial pit is usually located in the center of the occlusal surface buccolingually. However, mesiodistally it's located slightly toward the distal. So it's in the center buccolingually, but mesiodistally it's toward the distal. This is the distal, this is the mesial. Also, we have another two pits. There is the mesial pit and the distal pit. So there are three pits, the mesial, distal, and this is the central pit. In the two cusp types, the occlusal outline is characterized by being rounded lingual to the buccal cusp ridges. So the outline would be rounded. And there is lingual taper of the crown, or lingual convergence. It has two cusps, the buccal cusp and the lingual cusp, which will be well developed and directly opposite to the buccal cusp. There are two triangular ridges, the buccal triangular ridge and the lingual triangular ridge. There will be a central developmental groove, of course. This is a central developmental groove. The central developmental groove will be either straight or crescent in shape. When it will become straight, or when it's straight, it will form what's called the edge groove pattern on the occlusal surface. When it is crescent shape, it will form what's called the U-shaped pattern of the grooves of the occlusal surface. There are two pits usually. This is the mesial pit and this is the distal pit. Two circular depressions representing the mesial and distal fossa. So the mesial and distal fossa will be circular rather than triangular. This is the mesial and this is the distal fossa. And sometimes there are, or in many cases, there are supplemental grooves extending from the mesial and distal fossa into a buccal direction and lingual direction. For example, this will be the mesiobuccal and this is mesiolingual, distal buccal, distal lingual, and so on. So we have one central groove, two pits, two triangular ridges and supplemental groove, and two circular foci, mesial and distal.